Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here coming to you with another episode in the series of Canadian political commentary, punditry, insert word here that you want to use. So, in today's video, we are going to be talking about, I guess, the other end of the current Trudeau administration's climate policy. So, to be specific, when I say the other end, I mean their treatment of energy sector. So, oil and gas, principally, but I guess every other possible permutation of energy sector. So, where this really comes into head is with this first story here from Rex Murphy. In Newfoundland, the blows just keep on coming. This story is basically about how there's this project that is currently being reviewed by let's I don't remember the exact, but the company, there's this White Rose extension project going on right now, and it's currently being reviewed by the company doing it. And they've basically said straight up that unless they get support from the provincial and federal government, that they're probably going to cancel the project. And if the project is built, it would mean thousands of jobs and billions of dollars to the Newfoundland economy. It's a oil project. I think it's a refinery, but I'm not 100% certain offhand. But what the specific thing doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a refinery. It doesn't matter if it's a gas well. It doesn't matter if it's an offshore well. It doesn't matter. What matters is it's part of the oil and gas industry. And because of that, it is very likely that the Trudeau government is not going to give it support at all. And this is the kind of one-minded dogmatism that this radical environmentalism causes. We are not in a situation where Canadian emissions will make any difference, meaningful difference, in the short to medium term. Maybe you're talking about 1,000 years, or 200 years, or 500 years, maybe it might make a difference. But in the short term, next 100 years, our emissions aren't going to mean that much, especially in the amount that you can reasonably reduce it by without just destroying the entire country. Because obviously if we just put our emissions to zero right away, people, like, the entire country would be destroyed. Most jobs would not be operating, most people wouldn't have heating in the winter. It'd be terrible. And there isn't, there is reasonable case to be made that we do need to work and spend effort to move towards a greener, I don't like using it because it's kind of loaded, but reducing our carbon emissions. But neither of these things work. Like, reducing our carbon emissions does not mean not making oil. What it means is we need to take an energy source that is better than the alternatives. It's actually greener to develop oil in Canada if we can use this oil and gas production to displace older coal-fired power plants. It is greener to produce oil in Canada if that means we're not importing oil from far away. No matter how clean, if we can produce oil at roughly the same amount of net carbon emissions as any other country, say Norway, if our net emissions per barrel is roughly the same, then Canadian oil is better, and it has to be, the Canadian oil would have to be much worse per barrel for like Norwegian oil to be better, because Norwegian oil has to be shipped all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to Canada, and then once it gets to Canada, it has to be shipped where it needs to be used. And a lot of these places where it's used, for example, in like the center of the country, in like Ontario, Quebec, often involve putting it on trains then and shipping it by train. And there's been many instances of oil trains crashing, or oil tankers sinking or leaking oil out. So increasing the demand for the necessity for those things is a net loss for Canada, which is why for servicing like Ontario, Quebec area, it makes sense to build a pipeline from Alberta, because pipelines are safer than the trains or the boats, which are the alternatives. And similarly, for a place like Newfoundland, or not similarly, but for a place like Newfoundland, where Newfoundland, really before the fisheries collapse, but especially since the fisheries collapse, which is possibly its own video in itself, talking about Newfoundland's dire economic situation. But I guess to just go over it in general, since the fisheries collapse, Newfoundland's not had a great economy. Its population has collapsed. I believe it's dropped 200,000 people in the last 30 years. Net people, so like its total population I think 750 in 1990, and now it's about 1550 or 550,000. And there's really nowhere to believe that it's not going to keep going that way with the way things keep hitting Newfoundland. Because Newfoundland's problems really are, it's an island, so it's relatively difficult and expensive to manufacture things in Newfoundland, because everything has to be shipped by boat and then by train to get to any market where it's being sold, whereas being manufactured in Ontario or Quebec, it just has to get trained to most of its consumption spots, because most of the consumption in Canada is in the Windsor to Quebec City Cap or line. Like that region is about 2/3 of Canada by population. So that's the most of the market. So that is a big limiting factor on Newfoundland. Other big limiting factors are corporate tax regimes and regulatory regimes make it quite difficult for manufacturing in Canada, period. Especially new manufacturing plants. We shed manufacturing jobs every single year basically because of this. And the Trudeau government now is taking the one thing that had the potential to reverse Newfoundland's fortunes, which is the oil sector. Since I believe it was 2010 when offshore oil was discovered in Newfoundland, large, relatively cheap to extract, very high quality oil, and relatively, I guess I covered that. So, since that was discovered, Newfoundland's economy, or population, for example, has went from declining every year to slowly rebounding as people who've went west to work are now coming back to work in the Newfoundland oil sector. Youth that are growing up in Newfoundland are like moving out west to work. They have jobs in Newfoundland in the oil sector. And every spin-off sector that happens from this, because you have to keep in mind with anything. So this White Rose project is talking about thousands of jobs in itself for the project to make the plant work. You get a bunch of people who have high-paying, good jobs in a community, And that creates a bunch of spin-off jobs. You get people who have jobs running stores, people running restaurants, people moving things around, like transport people, like UPS drivers and stuff like that. Creates a bunch of jobs as spin-off jobs, and a lot of these spin-off jobs are relatively good jobs. A UPS driver is a relatively good job. I wouldn't say it's the best job in the world, but it feeds a lot of jobs that are on the market, especially probably in some of these rural, impoverished communities that you see in places like Newfoundland or in my native Nova Scotia, where 20% of the population lives in the poverty line, at or below the poverty line, mostly in these rural communities that are not really given any attention by any level of government, really. So the federal government failure here, and the Trudeau administration's failure here to support Newfoundland in this one regard, all they have to do is support these projects. Sure, maybe to the environmental crazies, radicals who don't understand that we can't immediately cut off oil, or that oil in the short term is actually a good solution because, again, my home native Nova Scotia, we use coal power still. If Newfoundland's producing cheap oil, and we can use that cheap oil to displace Nova Scotian coal power, we've won a big win for the environment. That is a good thing. And there's plenty of coal power plants in the rest of Canada. There's plenty of coal power plants in the world that Canadian oil could help displace. Furthermore, even if we don't use oil for power, even if we don't use oil for cars, even if we don't use oil for boats and planes, plastics aren't going anywhere. Your computer monitor? Plastic. All of your electronics? Probably a lot of plastic. Cars? Lots of plastic. Basically everything is plastic these days. Plastic is an oil product. Full stop. We don't have oil production. We don't have plastic. We can only deal with the artificial oil production, which doesn't really make sense. Doesn't make sense to make artificial oil or artificial plastics when we can get the raw material from the earth. That is just going to be mind-bogglingly less cost effective and make plastics way more money, which defeats one of the key purposes of plastics, which is that they are cheap. Other one being that they're really easy to mold and relatively strong. But so I guess to summarize this point I'm making here, the Liberal government federally has completely failed Newfoundland. Not even just in this one regard. Not just about this oil project or any other oil project like this. What has really killed Newfoundland is bad government policy. Year after year, government after government. And until we get a different change, until we get someone in Canada in power who recognizes the things that are killing Canada, which is the regulatory environment we live in, where you see car plants closing in Ontario, oil projects not happening in Newfoundland or in Alberta, other resource projects similarly. Until we fix this broken regulatory environment, we are going to continue to see these middle class, these working class jobs disintegrate, wealth inequality skyrocket, if that's something you care about, because if people don't have resource jobs, they don't have manufacturing jobs, what is the alternative? There's not enough white-collar IT jobs in the world, and frankly, not even everyone's cut out for it. It's a very specific, niche skill. And sure, some people can do it. Maybe some people who are currently working in resource or manufacturing sectors can do it. frankly, probably everyone can do it, but the question isn't whether people can do it. The question is, are there jobs available? Are there jobs where these people live? Do they want to do it? Do they have the resources to relearn a completely new skill? And do we want them to do it? Because you have to keep in mind, there's not just social and cultural issues with this outsourcing and destruction of the manufacturing and resource sector. We have more important issues at hand to this. I guess the best way to put it is there's a national security concern. Right now, China's a rising threat. They have concentration camps putting in Uyghurs. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. I don't actually know how that word's pronounced, but I'm going to go with Uyghurs. We have Uyghurs in concentration camps. They flagrantly run over rights and freedoms of their citizens. They don't care. The Chinese Communist Party that doesn't care. It doesn't even try to pretend to care. All it cares about is its own power and wealth. Not the wealth of its people, just the party members. I mean, Xi Jinping is a wealthy man. The average Chinese person is not, much to their chagrin. So, with this, we have this national security concern. We're losing this critical manufacturing jobs. And we have this social and cultural concern, where we have people who live in communities where there's not ever going to be an IT sector, for example, if there even was the demand for that. Second, there's not going to be demand for an IT sector because, newsflash, to those who aren't familiar, much of the IT sector in Canada or in the world relates to other companies. If all you have are IT companies, you don't have an IT sector. For example, one of my friends, he works as a computer programmer. He makes apps for companies. These apps are used by these other companies. Several of them are resource and manufacturing companies. Those companies no longer exist in Canada. Why do they need apps? But that's neither here nor there. The issue is not what demand the IT sector has. The issue here is that the broken regulatory environment we have in Canada that makes it uncompetitive to build resource projects, manufacturing plants, those are the two principal elements that makes it uncompetitive with corrupt dictatorial communist regimes like China is destroying our country. It is going to continue destroying our country until we fix this. And it will not be fixed until we get someone in power who wants to fix it. Trudeau does not care. All Trudeau cares about is his own power. He does not care about these things. He's had 5 years to fix it, and all he's done is made it worse. All he's done is hurt Newfoundland even more than it's already hurting. Makes it destroying confidence in investors, making less products being created in Newfoundland for the oil and gas sector, possibly making this West White Rose extension cancelled. And if it does get cancelled, you can sure as hell bet Newfoundland's getting a credit downgrade again. And since it's in a pretty big debt crisis, if its credit goes down again, it might not just be Newfoundland that's at risk. It might be all of Canada, because the federal government will have to bail out Newfoundland or risk the entire country's credit collapsing, at least provincially. Because part of the provincial credit ratings are predicated on the federal government will never let them go bankrupt. But I've said enough on this for today. If you liked the video, please like, share, subscribe, comment below if you have anything you want to ask me, anything you want to engage in. Otherwise, I bid you all a good day, and for those of you not in Nova Scotia, or sorry, for those of you in Nova Scotia, I pray to you that the hurricane does not take you out.